In 1471, Albrecht Durer was born in Nuremberg, Germany, where he lived until his death in 1528. Durer was the first internationally famous artist/celebrity outside of Italy. He was the most dominant artist in the 16th century Roman Empire, traveling and studying and meeting the leading humanists and artists of his time. He was one of the greatest creative geniuses in the beginning of so many things, an inventor of what's to come of sorts in the arts. He was one of only 3 siblings out of 18 that survived childhood. Durer lived in Nuremberg in its golden age. There's now a statue of him in Nuremberg, the first public statue of a painter made in 1828, 300 years after his death. He was so famous that shortly after his burial, a group of artists exhumed his body and made a cast of his face and hands, which have since been lost, but a lock of his hair still exists in the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. In 1484, Durer made his first self-portrait, as seen here, of himself at age 13. It was the youngest self-portrait of an artist of his time. By age 18, Durer had mastered the art of drawing lines. As you can see in this self-portrait, Durer was a mastery of drawing likeness. He concentrated heavily on value and texture to get every detail of likeness. He was fascinated by the human body, drawing nude models often. Durer painted his hair in detail in self-portraits to show his superior skills in the mastery of lines. He was one of the first artists to create self-portraits, the first to create a nude self-portrait, and a self-portrait of himself drawing. His self-portraits show his inner struggle to find out who he really is. Perhaps the most famous self-portrait of all time in history is probably created by Durer in 1500, seen here. He painted himself front-facing and symmetrical, instead of 3/4 facing like other portraits of his time. He did this to make himself resemble Christ, along with changing his hair color from brown to blonde and positioning his hands to resemble Christ's standard gesture of blessing, as you can see in this portrait. This painting shows his need to be Christ-like but not duplicate him, as that would be unacceptable to try and duplicate Christ in that time. He painted himself in many different forms, nervous, confident, and Christ-like. This just shows how torn he really was on who he really was. Durer was the first printmaker, so it was a good thing he signed all his pieces, marking all his art with his signature AD monogram shown here. The monogram represented his authenticity and ownership of every print, drawing, and piece of art he created. He signed virtually everything he created, even the smallest of rough sketches. The monogram was usually placed at the top center of the page, demanding acknowledgement. The AD monogram was often accompanied finished pieces with an engraving on an elaborate marble tablet explaining the piece and its purpose. He was the only artist to sign his art at this stature until the 1900s. He was the first artist to sue over copyright pieces of art. His arts were plagiarized all the way down to his monogram. He sued twice, once in Nuremberg and once in Venice, and won both times. His most famous thief was Marcantonio Raimondi. He sued him, and the judges ruled he could copy his prints, but couldn't claim them as a Durer original. The problem was, people were still allowed to copy his prints, and sometimes even the monogram, but not allowed to claim them as a Durer original. This still confuses people to this day on the authenticity of the pieces found. The first time Durer traveled as a journeyman was in 1494 for 4 years, a long time for a journeyman in that time. When he returned, he married 18-year-old Agnes for a small fortune from her father. He sent her a self-portrait while on his journey of himself, so she'd know the man she was going to marry. This is the self-portrait here. This portrait shows him still a bit youthful, but you can see in the drawing of his neck, nose, and hands, they are that of an adult. This self-portrait depicted him coming into adulthood. The fine wardrobe and thistle presented that of a man ready to become a husband. Their home and his workshop bought with the endowment, still stands in Nuremberg, now as a museum. Just 2 months after they married, he traveled across the Alps to Venice, which didn't exactly please Agnes. This was the true turning point of Durer's artistry. He learned to combine German and Italian artistry, the first artist of the sort. In his travels, he created the first color water paintings of the landscapes he traveled. Through his lines, he brought out the seductive side of Venice in human portraits. He learned to represent the human body like no one else prior. As you can see in this drawing of what is believed to be 2 Venetian prostitutes. Through this portrait and many more of women in Venice, his lines showed how the clothing clung to the women to bring out their figure. Durer thought the Italian perspective of artists were better. He thought they used the space more evenly and brought out 3D effect greater than the German art. So he mastered the Italian linear perspective and fed his knowledge across to other artists instead of keeping it to himself. Durer fancied Venice because he was of the gentleman there, as for in Germany, where his artist skills had others treat him like a mutt. After his second trip to Italy, he created a self-portrait of himself in gentleman fashion. He painted himself dressed in fancy garb, sitting at a high window in the Alps behind him. This is how he achieved his newfound vision of himself. This picture showed his newfound self-viewed statue full of hierarchy, education, and travels. To really shoot Durer into fame, he captured the people's newfound biggest fear in his art, the end of the world. He published and illustrated, the first to do so, a book of what the end of the world would look like according to the Bible. Durer invented printing, essentially. He created woodblocks, carvings, and copperplate molds to create prints. This way he could duplicate hundreds of exact prints. He sold these cheap enough for the less wealthy to afford. This launched his popularity into a dimension unknown to any other artist of his time. He even bought his own printing press so he could publish all his own work. He became his own publisher. He considered himself a businessman. He thought artists that worked for commissions were peasants feeding off the rich, waiting for handouts to create a single piece of art that only a few would see. They worked for less, they worked long hours, and the work wasn't steady. However, with the printing capabilities, the world could see his work. It was because of his newfound printing capabilities that he was able to create art of his own ideas. Instead of working for a commission with a specific outcome from the client, he could concentrate on an entire audience. He could create his own outcome of art he wanted and then find the right audience to market it to. His wife and mother often sold his art pieces at markets at prices that even common people could afford. In 1520, Durer headed north to the Netherlands with many prints of his work to turn a profit and spread his fame. Here he was treated like a lord, he wrote in his diary. He was able to see art on a more global level, with art from all over the world flooding through the ports. He loved the golden Inca objects and newfound art he was witnessing, and proclaiming it as its genius. He was impressed with anything from Mexico. He even used his prints as if they were currency to incur world objects, sweets, and art. Durer was a curious man, not just within humans, but within nature itself. Through his curiosity and appreciation for science and nature is expressed in his artwork shown here. He turned his nature pictures into actual forms of art by signing and dating them. He was the first artist to do this. He was a scholar combining science, math, and art to try and find an equation of beauty. His most famous engraving, and perhaps one of the most famously talked about pieces of art in history, was Melancholia, made in 1514. In this piece, you see his belief of intellectual with melancholy. Durer, in fact, believed that these two things had to come hand in hand, and often portrayed melancholy in his own self-portraits, as he thought of himself of higher genius. Though the light ray coming from the back shows hope of finding a balance someday. Durer died in 1528, thought maybe to be because of his contraction of malaria in his travels to the Netherlands. His legacy will never die, though, and has popped up throughout history, like in World War II when Hitler made Durer into an idol of German purity, and Nuremberg, Germany, the city of standard, a true heaven on earth to Hitler. This was one fitting for the fact that Durer believed artists were like godlike, comparing himself to gods and painting himself with Christ-like resemblances. He was protective of his creativity, yet strived to be world-renowned and created a legacy that would never die. He accomplished this moreover than I think he could have ever imagined. He was a rare artist of his time that conquered lines, colors, the human body, likeness, sceneries, printing, and business. He is truly one of the most famous artists of all time, and I think his legacy and his art will continue to present themselves throughout history.